run out of time. We always run out of time, and so I don't like to start too late because people need to get. Thanks. Welcome, everyone, to the penultimate conversation in the Knowing Africa series. And today, from a kind of snowy, blustery, stormy kind of day in Ottawa. But it's wonderful to have you all here in what I hope will be a warming conversation with Sarah Duff, S.E. Duff. My student looked at it and said, Essie, who's Essie? With Sarah Duff in conversation with our own Monica Patterson from Carleton University, and Christopher Ouma, who has been a participant in this series before. We last discussed Christopher's book on childhood in African literature. So we have today a really fabulous group of authors who are deeply immersed in the issues that are raised in Sarah's book. So I'm going to introduce themselves. I should introduce myself. I'm Shireen Hassam, the Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Politics at Carleton. This is a regular seminar series that runs in the fall term every year, and it is aimed at bringing into conversation books by and about Africa that make us think in new and interesting ways. And it's a completely random. There's no particular disciplinary theme to this seminar series. It just happens to be any book that I find interesting. So here's a book I find really interesting, A Tour de Force, Sarah, which it looks at childhood and youth in African history. And it's a tour de force because it spans an enormous time period. It gives us the most amazing cast of characters, from Equiano to Lily Moya to Nelson Mandela to Magema Fuze to Ellen Kuzwayo, and opens, in fact, with someone whose life has intersected with mine, Andrew Zondo, the so-called Amanzimtoti bomber. And just so, we have this fabulous cast of characters, but also this geographical span. So few books that seek to understand under any of the themes that we've discussed by cutting across nation-state boundaries, just thinking about the children that she wants to tell us something about. So we get into the themes through the lives of actual and sometimes, in fact, fictional as well characters. I just love the way in which you cross disciplinary boundaries, territorial boundaries, temporal boundaries, and make us think about this changing meanings of childhood and youth, both in terms of the age cohorts that are considered to fit into those categories, but also the sort of absolutely fascinating ways in which childhood is understood in cultural terms, and in terms of, questions like, do children have agency? Do children have rights? A whole range of fascinating questions. So thank you, Sarah. I should say Sarah is Assistant Professor of African and World History. Well, you're such a good candidate for that at Colby College in Maine in the US. Christopher Ouma, whose book, Childhood in African Literature, we know about now in our series, is an associate professor of literature at Duke University, where he began his new position this term. Christopher was at UCT before that. Welcome to the North. It's nice to have you in the same time zone, Chris.
Thank you.
And then Monica Patterson, my colleague at Carleton University, an associate professor here with a number of different hats. Monica is cuts across childhood studies, curatorial studies, anthropology and history, and is also the author herself of 2 books, one on curating difference, knowledge and violent pasts in public places, and an attempt to rethink the boundaries between anthropology and history, in anthrohistory, and in the making of knowledge. And her current research work is on understanding childhoods in late apartheid South Africa. So welcome to the 3 of you. Welcome to all the participants. What we do in the seminar normally is give the author an opportunity to tell us about the book, the key arguments in the book, and lay out a little, to some extent, the dimensions of the book. And then we will ask our 2 discussants to open up a discussion for us. We may go back to Sarah to respond. Let's see how it goes. And then we will have time for all of you to ask your questions as well. So, Professor Duff, I'm going to hand over to you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. That was a really amazing introduction. Thank you. I'm really, really grateful. I'm incredibly grateful to have been invited to present this book at this really fabulous seminar series. It's such a treat to be invited. Thank you. So thank you to Shireen. Thank you to the wizards behind the scenes who did all the heavy lifting for organizing these kinds of events. As we were saying earlier, this kind of work, these kinds of events take a lot of work. And thanks also to Chris and to Monica for so kindly giving up a lot of time to read this and to think up a response. I'm really grateful to all of you. And thank you everybody for being here. It's such a treat to be able to talk about this book to so many people I know and to some new people too. So thank you very, very much. What I was going to do is just to give you a sense of what the structure of the book is, where it comes from, why I wrote it, and to kind of give a bit of an overview of what the book is about. So it should take about 15 minutes. I'll keep an eye on the time though. So about 6 months after this book came out, which was at the end of last year, December 2022, I was on a panel at the biennial conference of the Society for the History of Childhood and Youth this last year at Guelph University. And I suggested during my session that maybe we shouldn't actually do the history of childhood anymore. And luckily, because this was at a Canadian university, nobody rioted. Everyone was very polite. I think everyone was also very tired. And what my point was that having had this incredible opportunity to write this book, I came away from writing this book with a set of questions about how it is that we go about doing the history of childhood and the limitations of the field. I've come away convinced of the necessity of broadening out our field of inquiry, moving from a focus on childhood to one on age. So I'm going to think about that and talk about that a little today as well. But I'll start with talking a bit about the book. So this book is a pandemic production. I was asked to consider writing it by Palgrave in 2019, before the pandemic, shortly after they launched a short histories series called Red Globe, meaning that initially this would only be a 30,000 word introduction to the topic. And I was vacillating about whether I'd agree to do this project. Would a short book count for tenure, which was uppermost in my mind at the time. But then the pandemic happened, and I realized I wouldn't be able to return to South Africa anytime too soon to complete the archival work I need to finish for my second project. And then Red Globe folded because of the pandemic, and Palgrave revised its offer, asking me to write a full-length introduction to the history of childhood and youth in Africa. And so under those circumstances, I said yes. I think it's always worth knowing something about, why and when, why was this book written in this way by this person at this particular moment? And the pandemic was really the answer for this. So I took a look at a few of the other general introductions to topics to African history before beginning this book. And I appreciated especially the first line of the acknowledgements for the first edition of The Making of Contemporary Africa by Bill Freund. And he observes, "It takes some temerity to attempt a synthesis of a field one studies and teaches, particularly if one is a younger scholar." And temerity is certainly the word. Again and again, as I wrote this book, I came up against my own lack of knowledge and expertise. And a full comprehension of everything you don't know is, of course, not an especially helpful position to occupy. And in my case, anyway, mitigates against addressing the issue because it produces a paralysis of incredible anxiety. So I found myself returning, as Bill Freund did, to the fact that this book is an introduction, that it opens up a field of astonishing richness and complexity to interested readers. And I was reminded that, like most scholars, I tend to teach beyond my own field of expertise. So this book became a kind of teaching exercise. And in fact, I hope that the book will be useful and interesting to students and to the people who lecture them. Since 2017, I've taught at a small liberal arts college in Maine, and much of my approach to this book was informed by the kinds of questions my students ask, varying from the very specific and practical to the conceptual. I was also guided by a few other principles. Firstly, although the field of the history of childhood and youth as it exists now, institutionally and in scholarly terms, can probably locate its origins to the cultural turn of the early 90s, although of course it's rooted in much earlier texts and scholarly debates, the scholarship on youth, age, and generation in Africa is much older and has been interwoven into the scholarship on African history since at least the 1960s. And I wanted to take an expansive approach, pulling in that earlier scholarship. This means, too, that I've brought in a number of contemporary scholars whose work is primarily on other topics like war or race or labor, but whose scholarship is nevertheless relevant to histories of childhood and youth. Secondly, I've tried to emphasize the work of scholars who are either from or are currently working on the continent. Thirdly, and perhaps most obviously, although an historian of South Africa, I've tried not for the region to dominate. And so, Shireen, I'm particularly grateful to your comments that my effort not to be too much of a South African historian does actually work. I've tried to have an equal emphasis on every region. At one stage, I had a list of contemporary African states and was trying to sort of make sure that I mentioned each one of them in the book. I'm not sure that I managed actually to achieve that, but that was my guiding principle. I've tried for an equal emphasis on every region. I think maybe someone might want to turn off there. There we go. I've tried to have an equal emphasis on every region to draw in as many states and societies as possible, and over, of course, a very, very long period of time. There are omissions in the book. There are problems with the book. The book focuses mainly on sub-Saharan Africa, and there is a fantastic scholarship on childhood and youth in the continent's diaspora, which Chris is engaged with, which is also not present. I've tried to provide a broad overview of the themes which have preoccupied scholars, but there are important pockets of work that are not here. And also I try to include every scholar, but I have not managed to do that. The book is divided into 5 chapters and moves both chronologically and thematically. The first chapter is on childhoods in pre-colonial Africa and was by far the most difficult for me to write, simply on the grounds that, like the period of time this encompasses, the literature is vast. My knowledge of pre-colonial Africa is enough to get me through teaching a course on African history, but I'm not an expert. What I emphasize in this chapter is the importance of age to the structuring of pre-colonial societies. Not only that age was a primary vector of power, like free or unfree status, gender, or other factors, but that it established the responsibilities and possibilities for every person at every stage of life. The second chapter is on children and enslavement. I work through the enslavement and pawning of children and young people in pre-colonial Africa, in the transatlantic slave and in the Indian Ocean trade. The middle chapter on race and childhood is about how children themselves and the idea of childhood were bound up with the colonial conquest of the continent in the 19th century, and I'll discuss that more in a moment. The final 3 chapters are all thematic. Each moves from the pre-colonial period into nearly the present. One is on labor and play, one is on education, and one is on protest and violence. And the logic of structuring the book in this way is that any chapter can be extracted and used to teach. So it is as much a coherent whole as it is a collection of essays. So it was written very much with teaching in mind. And while the book is an introduction to the field, I've also tried to present an argument with it, and an argument which draws especially on the writing of Abosede George and Ashita Pandey. And I develop it particularly in the book's middle chapter and in the conclusion, and I'm going to sketch it now too. So in 2020, the historian Sarah Marza wrote in a roundtable for the American Historical Review that the history of childhood and youth had failed to launch. Unlike gender or environmental history, for instance, histories of childhood and youth have not become mainstream beyond the few childhood studies programs and divisions which exist in some universities. She suggests that what makes childhood worthy of study is that it is a natural state which all people inhabit and thus becomes a strategy for writing histories which can cut across other categories of identity. And she also suggests that histories of childhood might have a kind of healing function, which is an argument I must admit I don't fully understand. And so historians responded to her provocation in a number of ways, and I suppose this is mine. So one response is that it's clear that, and this is an argument that the book makes, is that what one might call the mainstream of African history has long been attentive to age categories. Writing about East Africa, for instance, Thomas Burgess and Andrew Burton note that no concept or social category surpassed generation, both in terms of its importance and governing relations and as a source of values and sensibilities. The field of the history of childhood and youth generally locates its origins in the publication of Philippe Arrier's book, Centuries of Childhood, in the early 1960s. And although historians debate the arguments that he makes in the book, its main achievement is in providing a convincing argument that childhood has a history. But scholars of Africa have not needed this convincing because of the centrality of generation to structuring African societies. To write histories of colonial rule is to write histories of generation. To write histories of decolonization is also to write histories of generation. That this is an absolutely inescapable facet of writing African history. A second response to Marza would be to emphasize the more recent scholarship on histories of childhood and youth in Africa, which is marked out by its awareness of the making of age categories over time and their shifting social and political meanings. The book's middle chapter on race and childhood pays particular attention to the constitution of the category of the African child as both a racial and an age category. It emerges in the early 20th century and encapsulated the contradictions of European attitudes towards colonial rule and in the interwar and post-war eras of African development. The 19th century ideology of the innocent child was capacious enough to include a range of ideas, some of them ostensibly contradictory about childhood, particularly when this age category came up against stereotypes relating to race and class. As a result, while social reformers in the 19th and 20th centuries argued that all children, regardless of identity, were innocent, they did also believe, for instance, that white urban working class children were more inclined to behave badly because of their working class identity. In this way, children were always innocent, but could also be wild and dangerous, and this was especially the case for African children who bore the burden of racialized identity. The African child was in perpetual need of rescue from backward parents and African institutions. The colonial project itself was justified via the humanitarian construct of the African child. This child represented a potentially developed and civilized future. Please note my heavy use of quotation marks. If only the child could be raised and educated by European Christian schools and carers. As George explains, this was a figure through whom imperial liberalism became imaginable as an enterprise of proliferating vulnerabilities that reinstated colony, empire, and imperial nation states as guarantors of humanity and rights. But at the same time, the African child was also always dangerous, tempted by idleness and excess, emotionally uncontainable, and intellectually weak. The African child could always be and not be saved. As George writes, the African child became articulated as a sign of vulnerability, African pathology, and the paradoxical impossibility of African development. The African child captured colonial powers thinking about the future potential and inherent backwardness of the continent. Metaphors of childhood were thus intertwined with the justification of and resistance to colonial rule. During the developmental era, colonial officials might refer to young colonies in need of guidance as they matured in preparation for endlessly deferred eventual self-rule. But anti-colonial activists also reached for the same metaphors. In Buganda in the 1930s and 40s, as Carol Summers writes, the burgeoning nationalist movement referred to itself and Uganda as existing in a state of adolescence. And adolescence offered a way to legitimize rebellion and opposition to British guidance. Adolescents achieve maturity not through the dutiful obedience and acceptance of subordination of a client, but by rebelling, pointing out injustice, sometimes by making mistakes. Adolescence was a stage on the path to self-determination, self-sufficiency, and independence. But ideas had and have material consequences. African children in elite mission schools and Christian convert families, for instance, could be aware of their status as African children, as bearers of the work of Christianity and the civilizing project, while also feeling the sharp consequences of colonial rule. Indeed, the book traces the degree to which multiple definitions of childhood and other age categories existed at the same time in the same place, and the fact that they changed over time. Under colonial and settler rule, pre-existing notions of childhood and youth, themselves subject to change even before conquest, were overlaid with new ways of defining age categories. As Zahid Adarinto observes, modern childhood did not simply replace the pre-existing or pre-colonial traditional one. Instead, these modes coexisted, creating often opposing and contradictory results. While it might be tempting to identify a monolithic European understanding of childhood and youth, that also would be misleading. European ideas about childhood were hotly contested and debated in the 19th century, and especially as new ideas about childhood and youth were generated in the colonial encounter, and obviously particularly as regard questions of race. So the book describes how children moved between spaces which required them to be children or adults in different ways. Innocent young children in the Christian home or mission school, young man or woman in the traditional household en route to becoming a full adult, a process marked by specific customs, and infantilized adult in full employment in settler states or under colonial rule. The confluence of race, class, gender, and age under colonial or settler rule produced a specific set of dynamics which shaped the experience of age in very different ways. And I think it's important to note that children and young people often knowingly negotiated these age categories. They understood what kinds of behaviors were expected of them in these very different contexts. So a final and third response is that Africans could never outgrow their childhood in colonial contexts, something experienced especially intensely by African women. Africanness itself was constructed by colonial administrators in relation to childishness and childlike behavior, one of the legacies, in fact, of the abolitionist movement. As Ashita Pandey notes in her response to Maza, what makes childhood worthy of historical scrutiny is not the fact that we all inhabited something called childhood in the past, but that some were and are considered incapable of outgrowing childhood. What makes children a powerful tool of critique and analysis is that there is also a politics to refusing to leave it behind. I would expand on this. If childhood is defined relationally, it makes little sense for us to study it in isolation from people inhabiting other age groups. The existence of childhood as a category constitutes adulthood and adolescence and youth. So I end this by suggesting that we relinquish histories of childhood in favor of a more expansive interest in histories of age more broadly. There's a virtue in adding children as children to social history in the interests of making richer and more complex our understanding of the past. And I would say it is as interesting and profound to think about age as a vector of power in societies, to think about age in relation to gender, to class, and to race. Age categories from infancy to old age are among the very few categories of identity which most people will inhabit, fitting themselves to modifying or refusing the shifting expectations and behaviors associated with those categories. All people remember how they moved from one to the next and might anticipate or fear those that lie in their future. And so it's to this human history of aging that historians might turn to understand how societies have imagined their futures. So thanks very, very much.
Lovely. Thanks, Sarah. That was great. Monica, we'll turn to you next.
Hey, thank you so much, Sarah. So I just wanted to reiterate what an honor and pleasure it is to be among such esteemed company and in conversation with scholars that I've learned so much from, who also happen to be lovely, amazing people as well. So thanks to all of you. And as Shireen mentioned, I am pretty deeply steeped in an interdisciplinary position within my own work and my own training. So I'm a cultural anthropologist and historian who's worked on different constructions of childhood in late apartheid South Africa. And in reading this book, that feels like such an incredible gift from Sarah, I was really taken back to my own experiences of trying to research an aspect of children's lives and also the more conceptual idea and notion of childhood. So in doing this work, as I think Sarah experienced as well, I really had to cast quite a wide net. So it's not the typical historian's project where you can go to the archive and say, give me all the files on, you know, this specific uprising or this event that happened. When you're trying to engage with and sort of dig into the experiences of people who have not been deemed worthy of documentation in many cases, there's a real challenge there. So part of what I'm really interested in thinking about the way that Sarah put together this book is how she works with the unevenness of the kind of paper trail and other trails left by children as a way of actually gaining further understanding. Again, there's a kind of duality here, I think, of the work she does to understand what actual children were doing and experiencing and thinking and knowing, and then the ways in which our ideas and past people's ideas about children and childhood are constantly sort of imbricated on each other. So while this is explicitly not an attempt at an in-depth historical overview of the continent, Sarah helps us to consider the limitations of these overviews, along with some of the methods and concepts that are the often taken for granted stock and trade of historians. So I thought that I would focus my comments on three main domains of contribution that I see. This was actually a challenge because there's so many things that I could think about and so many different ways to frame this. But I see some significant contributions being made here to, firstly, our understandings of children, youth, and childhood. Secondly, I think this contributes greatly to African history and not only the sort of content of what has been produced and what we know about the past across the continent, but in terms of how history is done. So thinking about the production of history and the craft of history and the possible futures for that work. And then thirdly, I think that there are a lot of contributions here to some big epistemological questions about the nature of knowledge itself and how these map onto historians' methods and historical sources. I think a sort of fourth shadow topic that you might see peeking through in my comments is in thinking about this book from a pedagogical perspective. So I have had the pleasure of using some of this book, and I'm actually going to use the whole book in my course on the history of the figure of the African child that I'll be teaching in the winter next semester. And I can attest that this is a book that is really accessible, I think, to undergrads, and that is no small feat. It's also, I think, quite engaging to upper level students who are coming with a bit more depth in terms of content and also in terms of their own capacities for reading academic texts. So I think that's really great. So anyone who studies children or youth will be all too familiar with the ways in which these people are marginalized in our societies today, and also likely in our own fields of study. So while there are now rigorous subfields within many disciplines that focus on the history or the anthropology or the sociology of children or childhood, the interdisciplinary critical field that has sort of congealed around child studies really broke onto the scene really only in the 1990s. Now, that's not to say that other scholars weren't doing some of this work and engaging in some of these issues, but coming out of the UK, the new social studies of childhood that was put forward, especially by Alison James and Alan Prout, touted a paradigm shift that they were trying to affect. So this new social study of childhood was in many ways, I think, a reaction against the kind of territorial claim and authority that psychology had held on the study of childhood, of children in particular, for many, many years. And the uncritical approach of many of these scholars, which is an approach that has not completely died out, was to really present childhood as a series of stages that are essentially universal, that all people go through. So the new social studies of childhood was trying to assert the importance of looking at the variety of childhoods that are out there, also laying bare the ways in which that previous scholarship was really privileging certain perspectives, and giving us a sense of what children are and what they experience that should have been much more specifically located in terms of, you know, not just time and place, but culture, thinking about all of the social vectors of power, like class, race, ethnicity, ability, gender, many of those other factors. So I think that this book is an excellent example of how you can actually do this work to engage with the knowledge and perspectives and activities of children in a way that doesn't erase their particularities. So in opening, Shireen mentioned this fabulous cast of characters. We meet the child Sundiata Keita, Magwaza Fuze, Lily Moyo, Nelson Mandela, many others. And I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate this move, which seems so simple in a way, and it's so compelling that I think it's easy to overlook the kind of intervention that it's making. So to start each of these chapters with an individual is actually a very political move, because children are so often anonymized, they're genericized, they're ventriloquized. And when we're looking at the historical record, obviously we're limited because the further back in time you go, you know, the less access we have to information and to different types of sources. So I wanted to really just register my appreciation for this move, because Sarah manages to make some really astute arguments and observations and identifications of some broad trends in history, but she does that in a way that does not strip the humanity and the individuality from her subjects. I think when I think about this work in relation to the field of African history, Sarah does a great job, I think, herself, and in her comments, you know, she makes such a strong and convincing case for the importance of thinking about children and youth in any question, in any study of any aspect of African history, because children and youth do not exist on some isolated island, right? They are integrated into every aspect of our lives, whether we personally have children in our immediate households or families or not. So I think that the way that this work touches down in certain times and places to specifically examine historical events, individuals, and cultural practices, but then also thinks about the connections between people and places to provide some insight into these wider networks. She says this allows her to challenge some of the most pernicious stereotypes of Africa. So Sarah says, this was no dark continent, in quotes. Its people have long been connected to other regions of the world, and its societies are complex, differ across space, and have changed over time. So I think this is something that that every scholar working on any aspect of Africa aspires to do. But I think Sarah really does it in a way that, for me, is just a beautiful inspiration and model as well. Her work also makes a very strong case for the importance of interdisciplinary approaches and diverse sources. So this is definitely a historical book. She is a very established historian, but she's reading across. So she's looking at novels, at missionary letters, at anthropological accounts, at epics. She's also working across territory, across time, across age. And so I think that this is something that I really appreciated about this work. In terms of the last of my categories, thinking about epistemological challenges, this is a current that runs through the book, which sets up the reader to be a critical thinker. And again, from a pedagogical perspective, I think that glimpse into the kind of backstage of the craft of history, of the process of doing and writing research, has been so valuable for me in the classroom, because she actually is quite transparent about some of the challenges and limitations of the sources that she can access. Also, the key concepts that have been used in historical analysis. She's pushing the hardest against this generic blanket category of children and youth, and offering an alternative to think in a more nuanced way about age. But she's pushing against a lot of these core categories as well. And I think that the book also should be of interest to people who are working around the world, because it shows how thinking with African examples and using African materials can really help us to get to a much deeper place in terms of our own conceptual understandings. So Sarah looks at some of the key concepts that frame historical analysis, working through and troubling or nuancing many of these key units of analysis, thinking about individuals, cultures, ages, genders, generations. And then also, if you look at the chapter headings, some of these other key categories, thinking about education, about work, about slavery. Once you read this book, you realize that these key terms, which might seem obvious and self-evident and might seem to have a sort of basic consensus of understanding around them, are not at all stable categories, right? This is something that I've experienced in my own teaching as well. And I think that there's something to be gained from really stepping back, or maybe conversely, really diving deeply in to parse and to sort of take apart these categories and question what they mean. So let's see. I had a couple of questions. I mean, I have a ton of questions, but I'll try to maybe just leave with a couple. So one of the things I'd love to hear more of, and this might be a bit unfair to ask of a historian, but I'm curious to know your take on what histories of the present are being forged by children and youth in Africa today, and how. And then also, how might historians and scholars of children and childhood better engage with the children of today, and particularly those in Africa? How can we better engage with their knowledge and experiences and perspectives? And I'm just thinking about this current moment, however we define it. We're not really post-pandemic. We're in some complex phase coming after some very messy and still ongoing ruptures in our social fabric that have been experienced in really different ways. But to step a bit more broadly, in 1989, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was ratified, and I think that this has come with a lot of advocacy work. The proliferation of digital content and also platforms has given young people, I think, unprecedented voice in some ways, and it has created the opportunity for them to document themselves and to leave a kind of trail of documentation for future historians to engage with. So my next question is, and I think I'll leave it there for purposes of time, what are the possibilities and challenges of engaging with children's perspectives for the next generation of historians in light of these kind of unique developments that I think we're living in the age of presently? Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Monica. Chris.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Shireen and the folks at Carleton for this platform. And I'd like to obviously thank Sarah for this wonderful book. And I shouldn't say return the favor, but to be enriched by this moment, since Sarah was also part of the panel that helped discuss my book. I think this is an amazing book. I think that I really enjoyed thinking about a conceptual history of childhood. And I think that is for me, the conceptual effect of the book is going to be more powerful. And as a number of people who've spoken have just said, there are some real pedagogical gems in the way that the book comes together. When I finished reading it, I remember thinking maybe this book should have come out before I wrote my own book, because there's something very ground clearing about some of the questions that people ask me about my book that this book answers. So I really appreciate that ground clearing logic and the gesture. And I think the powerful nature of how one can conceptualize the history in a very epic sort of manner. The historical timelines that you're working with are incredibly generative, and it must take a lot of difficult intellectual labor to be able to hold them together in that sense, but also just make that count for Africa as a continent. And I think when we drill down from that, we see the transnational logic that the book is trying to conceptualize. So I really, really appreciate this. And I think obviously I would be teaching this alongside my own work. So my response is going to be, and when I think of how I began writing and thinking about childhood, I think that there's something very ordinary, there's something in the unconscious in the way that we think about childhood, in a way that we sort of ignore how powerful thinking about it, sitting with it might be conceptually. And I'm currently reading a book by Gary Wilder, and where he conceptualizes concrete utopianism, and he talks about the way we can make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And that's the sort of effect I felt reading your book, is that the way you work through childhood as a concept across the ages within the different contexts in Africa and how you make it count in thinking about a global history of the world, questions of power and other things, childhood becomes this thing that is not just something that we put in the unconscious and say it's a process, we're going to get through it. We are developing the way we are thinking about the world. It's just part of a stage. I think what I found in the book is just your ability to move between the strangeness and familiarity of childhood across time. So my comments are going to be mostly in appreciation, and I will and I think a couple of questions that people have asked, and I think, Monica, one of the questions you've asked is what I was thinking about. And so I'm hoping that as I walk through my own response, other questions might come up for people in the audience. But so I thought that this book is a rich conceptual history of childhood and youth in Africa, whose strength lies in a very expansive historiography that it takes on, given the scale of Africa in relation to such a loaded analytical category like childhood and even youth. Given what I assume is the audience of Duff's book, she mounts her analysis on a platform of sort of a linear temporality in engaging with this history, the center of which is the pre-colonial and colonial paradigms of historical time. While these can sometimes over-determine the place of colonialism and its experience in the continent in relation to how scholarship marks historical movement, Duff's analysis takes on very expansive conceptual metaphors for writing a history of African childhood, which really punch above and beyond what could become a very linear plotting of historical timelines. Such an analytical formulation, such as age and generation, and I like the formulations that are part of the taxonomy of the book, age and generation, work and play, or even enslavement and unfreedom, they are quite generative markers to the scale of Duff's historiography of childhood. While Duff calls these themes, they do far more than thematize. They organize the historiography towards forcing readers to reflect on the conceptual effect of childhood in their understanding of Africa. Now, here is a statement that captures the overall potential intervention of the book, and I'm going to read it. Sarah writes it, moving through the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial eras, the book pays attention to how definitions of childhood and youth changed over both time and space, and how the experience of being a child or a youth also changed, often in intersection with questions of race, class, and gender. The book touches on the questions which have interested historians as they have studied children and young people. How does the inclusion of children in the histories of labor, both free and unfree, and migration, for instance, change how we think about work and movement? How are histories of play and education important for thinking about the constitution of colonial and post-colonial states? And how do we approach young people's involvement in politics? These questions demand that historians not only insert children and young people into existing accounts of the history of the continent, but also that they are alert to how age itself serves to shape people's positions within African societies, end of quote. And Sarah, I think the way you're moving towards thinking about age also answers one of the questions I was going to ask. So I'm really grateful for this conversation. In other words, Duff's engagement with African childhood allows us to see childhood as not only constituted by the movements of historical time within the evolution of African societies, but also co-constituting African identities, conceptions of statehood, which we often take for granted, obviously from very adultist perspectives, policy, and the African social environment. In my own book, I argue for the ways in which the imagination of childhood in contemporary African literature demands a rethinking of the category childhood as paradigmatic in the production of African identity in the contemporary world, and not just as part of an evolving process or development. When you think of the colonial library, and I think Duff engages with this in the chapter on education, and thinking about some of the background from which some education policies are based off, which are about a logic of development, a logic of process, which is part of this not just colonial library or imperial library, but these sort of fantasies and projections of what Africa means in relation to imperial modernity. Duff's book, and indeed as excellent historical work is meant to do, clears the ground for many of the assumptions that my own book starts with. In crucial ways, Duff's book makes an argument, an important argument, about the positionality of conceptual childhood in the historiography of Africa, decentering the monopoly of adultist lenses in the scholarly production of history. Duff is constantly asking how childhood and youth produce their own historical frameworks. In her introductory chapter, Duff reminds us of the ways in which age and generation occupy powerful positions in evolving societies based on, and I quote, meanings attached to the attainment of certain ages. And that's for me is really, it might look simple, but it's quite powerful. Because such semantic investments are not just about the production of social discourse, no. But as we know from our own experiences, the basis of very Foucauldian biometrical logics of documentation, surveillance, and power, i.e., when you can go to school, when you can drink, when you can drive, when in North America you can own a gun, when you can be conscripted, etc. In other words, through thinking about age and generation as a conceptual metaphor, we can place childhood at the very center of not only how we understand family, kinship, etc., but also how the circuits of societal power define themselves, create, and order our world through investments in age categorization. Now, the conceptual formulation enslavement and unfreedom allows Duff to expand historical temporalities, placing childhood at the center of the world before the incursion of imperial modernity, while articulating its meanings in relation to the difference between enslavement and pawnship. Duff follows this chapter with one on race and childhood, which establishes how childhood gains currency. And I want you to keep the word currency in mind. In other words, it becomes the transactional basis for imperial incursions, colonial institution making, and its encounter with Africa. It's worth reflecting here, especially as philosophers of childhood who engage with the cultural context of Africa do, that these encounters, Duff so eloquently articulates, are overdetermined by an imperial library. Alta Jablo and Dorothy Hammond, I'm sure most of us are aware of their work, aptly titled it The Africa That Never Was. An imagination of Africa that was largely a speculative mishmash of explorers' misrepresentations, the moralization of missionary work, and the projected violence of colonial infrastructure. This becomes the discursive grounds upon which the imperial encounter is mounted, one which, as Mudimbe has reminded us way back in the early 90s, is a structural logic of the invention of a continent. How do we invent a continent? You project a certain imagination and you use certain metaphors, which become very powerful in how people encounter that space, in how they formulate policy for that space, in how they roll out any kind of infrastructure that is meant to assimilate that space into global modernity. In this way, Duff delves into the connections between the development of racialized childhood in the age of enslavement and the scientific racism that founded majority of colonial policy and institution making in Africa. Hence, engaging with schooling and education, as Duff does, means grappling with what becomes a structural feeling. Here, and writ large in the book, Duff draws from not just historical scholarship, but, as a lot of people have mentioned, memoirs and other forms of life writing by Africans. Achebe's The Education of a British Protected Child is a great choice, for instance, which is part of an array of life writing for Africans who straddled a specific moment of transition that was overdetermined by such binaries as tradition versus modernity, orality versus literacy. And often childhood was the sort of transactional basis upon which these concepts were seen to be understood and how they were seen to be developing in relation to the continent. Achebe's work could be read alongside a number of others. Ngugi Othiongo's memoir trilogy, which came out recently, also goes back to that moment. So there's a way in which childhood as a concept, as a metaphor, is coming back in helping people demystify some of the assumptions that continue today about the continent's identity, about its relationship to modernity, about very contemporaneous issues that we still deal with today. Now, the chapter on work and play deploys the history of childhood in Africa to engage with that of racial capitalism, broadly defined, in ways that connect this history to that of gender and therefore draw on an intersectional logic in which childhood is not only gendered, but its deployments within the labor needs of a global capitalist project is also about the production of class. Here, one can also see the connection with the history of enslavement and pawnship that Duff discusses earlier, in which childhood's currency was also about the transactions of class, debt, peonage, and credit in some African societies. Here, one can see how the history of childhood and labor is adjacent, for instance, to Cedric Robinson's critique of Marx, not only about how enslavement is diminished as pre-capitalist modes of production as a major contributor to modern global capitalism, but also how the labor of women and children is marginal to the centrality of a white male factory floor laborer. One can also draw here on the work of Angela Davis, in which race, gender, and class stand at a crucial conjuncture in which the gendered exploitation of labor through ante and post-bellum America, for instance, created this paradoxical logic in which the value of reproduction complemented future visions of the demographic of the enslaved, but also clashed with the present need for a strong and productive body in the plantation field. Here, Duff's chapter also makes an important distinction between the childhood labor governed by kinship relations in societies that precede colonial incursion, as opposed to those that sought to incorporate, and I use the word incorporate very carefully, African sort of labor economy into part of the sort of global movements of capital. As I conclude, I will quote a poignant statement from Duff's final chapter titled Politics and Violence, which is as much about Duff's historical method on the history of African childhood as it is about a conceptual logic that governs the book. And I quote here, "The fact that scholars have tended to attend to boys and young men's involvement in politics is a reflection of, among other things, boys' presence in the archive as the colonial state tended to record their resistance more than girls." And this really beautifully captures not just the conceptual effect of the book, but the kinds of pedagogical investments that the book is going to have in the classroom and the kinds of interventions it will have in thinking about historical method, in thinking about historiography, in thinking about archives, in thinking about, I should say, a future history of childhood. So for me, it really captures the powerful intervention the book is making. And to round off, just a couple of very practical questions, and some of which have been asked in different guises. The first one is, in your view, what are the most exciting things about childhood in Africa at present? And I think Monica has mentioned social media. Lately, we see around the world debates around addiction to social media. I know that one of the most powerful policies around social media platforms and companies is how you create a policy around age and content and all of that stuff. And yet, again, we understand that part of the power of social media, as Monica says, is the way that we can get an archive of the present to think about a future history of childhood. So there are really interesting things about thinking about childhood and the present, and of course, in the background of all the madness that's going on in the world. Second question, speculate with me, Sarah. What do you think would be a future history of childhood in Africa? And I think you've mentioned this in talking about age. So those are the questions that I had, and I really appreciate all this work, Sarah, with a book that I think is going to be extremely powerful in many classrooms. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Chris. So, Sarah, there are some questions from both Monica and Chris. Do you want to take a couple of minutes to answer them, and then we'll open it up? Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much, both of you. Really, I'm so grateful. I've mentioned this in other contexts, but I wrote much of this book on my own, and because of the realities of the pandemic. So it wasn't a part of the usual conversations that we have when we write books, which are often the conversations, the aspect of writing books that makes it a pleasant experience. So to have these conversations subsequently is especially wonderful, and to have these conversations with two such thoughtful readers. I'm really grateful to both of you. Thank you. I want to just add that, I mean, this is a book that draws on the very rich, complex scholarship on histories of childhood and youth produced by so many scholars over a long period of time. And so I'm hoping that this book also just points people in the direction of those work. I sort of sometimes feel that I'm here as the hype woman. Read these people. This book is sort of telling you to go to those authors, because they're doing the amazing and incredibly complex and wonderful stuff. So I do want to say that I'm here as a kind of a representative of the field as well. And thank you for your questions. They are really fantastic. I actually wanted to begin with a comment that you made, Monica, which wasn't really part of your questions, but sort of feeds into your other ones, where you you said, historians of childhood are often faced with this question of, how do we work with the unevenness of the paper trail, as you put it really nicely, as it applies to children, and the fact that, and one of the things that I sometimes people are surprised when I say this, is just that, if you do the history of childhood, in Africa, children are all over the archive, particularly in colonial and post-colonial archives. And it was precisely for the reason that you mentioned now, Chris, in your response, is that colonial states were interested in the monitoring of particular kinds of children. And so that generates an enormous amount of paperwork and actually it's surprisingly detailed, often quite textured information. And of course, there are plenty of children whose thoughts and ideas are kept in diaries and letters, but those children tend to be middle class. In settler states, they tend to be white. And so the unevenness of this archive, I don't have an answer for you for how do we address the unevenness in the archive, except to say, as you said, we cast our nets widely and we look everywhere and we see what we can find. But I think that it's useful to take the unevenness of the archive and to help us to think more broadly and conceptually about how we address the question of the history of childhood. Christine Alexander, who's here, is the author of probably the best titled paper ever written in the history of the childhood, which is Can the Girl Guide Speak? And in that wonderful piece, drawing on the work of other scholars too, Christine, it sort of asks us to think a little more carefully about, how do we think about, how does this focus on children's voices produce a particular kind of scholarship that, what is it about this sort of interest in children's voices that will produce a particular kind of scholarship? And so if we sort of take this idea naively, it means that we're going to write histories of very particular kinds of children who are very noisy in archives and leave out those that are silent. So it asks us, so this unevenness asks us to think in more sort of critical ways about how we engage with archives and how we kind of extract and use and interpret what we need from archives. So that for me then addresses, this, preoccupation with questions of, say, children's voices or children's agency, locating children's agency in the archive. All children have agency, they just experience it different, exercise it, conceptualize it differently. It asks us to write more complex, more thoughtful accounts of childhood that engage both with the experience of childhood and with the concept of childhood. And so the questions then that both of you ask, how do we, what would a future history of childhood of Africa be like? And I think that, yes, I would say, let's think about age, but I would say very specifically, let's think about how age works in relation to the exercise of power in African societies, and obviously more broadly. I mean, Monica, you began by saying, the children sort of exercise, sort of occupy often a marginalized space within societies, within scholarship. And I would also point then to other age categories which exist often in the same marginalization. I mean, the very elderly, for instance, and to think, what can be gained by thinking about, say, the marginalization of children on the grounds of their youth alongside the marginalization of the very elderly? What kind of a history of power does that produce for us? So I suppose that what I want to do is just ask us to think more expansively about how age works with power in the structuring of societies. I think I'm reaching the point now where I'm just repeating myself. So those are my initial thoughts. I think I'll probably have more as we proceed, but that's an initial response. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Great. So we'll open it up now for discussion. And if you could just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. It's always good on this platform if people unmute their camera, what's the word, allow us to see you. While you are thinking, do please ask questions. While you are thinking, Sarah, I wanted to ask a question that's perhaps a little bit unfair, and that is about whether you thought about using visual media at all in conceptualizing your work, because there is in fact so much art made around childhood, right? There are paintings over time. There are various kinds of depictions, mother and child, but also, there's so much art about particularly girls on the cusp of the transition from young to adolescent, youthful to, those sorts of media. I was thinking so much when I was reading your book of the wonderful exhibition done by Terry Kurgan called Purity and Danger, which is also about exploring that kind of liminal moment, and the idea of children as also knowing subjects and potentially dangerous, not simply facing danger, but the extent to which they appear to be dangerous to adults. So I just throw that out there because, as I said, this is such a tour de force that I can't imagine how you could have included anything more. But I wonder if that's another project actually for you, to read the visualities of childhood.
Sure. Thank you. So yes, absolutely. I mean, I also think, and I mean, this is a very South African response, that I mean, I also think about the various controversies that have erupted over art exhibitions featuring particularly girls, often sort of naked girls, and the sort of the anxieties about the portrayal of those children, and how this invokes sort of much bigger sort of debates about gender and sexuality and colonialism and post-colonial rule and so on. And so that art sort of is this sort of this point of connection for so many anxieties and concerns, that it's such an incredibly rich source. So no, as you know, there's very little art in this book, but I was going to say two things in response to what you were saying. The first is that I'm aware of the fact that there's some new scholarship being done on children's art, on children's drawings, and I find that really interesting and really exciting, because it expands. I mean, that one of the something that the history of childhood as a field is routinely accused of, with some justification, is that it's more about adult ideas about children than about the children themselves. And while letters and diaries from middle-class children can kind of answer that, that's only one sort of small answer to that question. And I think children's art and children's drawings becomes a way into thinking about that more broadly. And I think that is a really useful and incredibly important way of sort of opening up who we get to include in the history of childhood. My other response is that I have included a lot of photographs in this book. I wanted this to be a well-illustrated book, just because I like reading a book with photographs. One of my regrets with this book is that I haven't addressed the photographs enough. So I'm hoping I send this wish out into the ether that if Palgrave were to want to put out a second edition, I would like to write more about the photographs in this book, because children are everywhere in photography of the continent from the 19th and the 20th centuries, whether it's from it's sort of missionary photography of a very particular genre, or the incredible work of the Legion of Photographers who photograph South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle. It's, children are completely present, they're undeniable. And so I think that there is a history of childhood to be written through photography, which would be extraordinary. Could I add one other thing? This is just in response to Monica and Chris's questions, that, what is an exciting thing to write about in the future? And I point to this in the conclusion as well, and that Africa is the youngest continent, that, the majority of people living on the African continent are very young. And I think that needs to animate a lot of scholarship and thinking about the future. The fact that this is such a young continent, it frames Africa as a dangerous continent. I mean, the Gates Foundation is all over this, that, this represents a threat to the rest of the world, this is a migrant threat, and so on. But it also causes us to frame and understand the continent in very different ways. So I would really sort of want to point people in the direction of the continent's demographics, and the work on waithood, for instance, is really an important intervention in this, but I think that we could definitely say more about it.
Thanks, Sarah. Leila Mokhtari, do you want to ask your questions? Would be so much better than us reading it or me reading it. Leila? Yeah, there she is. Cool.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. First of all, I'm an undergraduate student, and I'm studying childhood and youth studies. And I'm working on a research about child marriage, focusing on Middle East and Africa. And I was wondering to know about how this issue was in the past and how it is now in African children.
I just wanted to, sorry. I wanted to ask you just a question. When you say this issue, what do you mean? Do you mean child marriage or? Okay, right. Okay. I mean, that's a wonderful question and an enormous question. And I'm sure that you know the scholarship on this much better than I do. And I'm sure you know particularly the scholarship on India, which I'm sure would be incredibly helpful to you. And I think that what your question does is that it asks us exactly, well, who exactly is a child?
And
And how,
Sarah, before you
Yeah.
continue that, I wonder if we could take Tendai's question, which is exactly the same sort of area of child marriage, and then maybe you can answer them together, because they're asking about child marriage, I suspect, in two very different contexts within Africa. So Tendai, Elvis, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Yes. So mine it's more of a comment, but yeah, I think Sarah, you're about to respond to that. It's about conceptualizing childhood. What does it mean to be a child in Africa? But yeah, I see you're already responding to that. But thank you.
Oh, you don't want to ask your question, which is about it's actually age of consent. Is, I think, at the heart of his question, and that the age of consent is a kind of way of thinking through contestations in customary marriages, practices contestations within cultures. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, thank you both of you for your questions. And yeah, I mean, what this question asks us to do, and I'm sorry, this is a cowardly answer. I'm not going to give you any sort of precise answer to this because every context is so specific. But what I would say is that the reason why this question just comes up over and over again is because it asks us to ask, it points us to this question of who is a child? Who is an adult? You know, at what point do we decide childhood ends and adulthood begins? Because, you know, the answer that you know, you would probably say for a girl is, oh, well, menstruation, that's a really good indicator, you know, of who counts as a girl and who doesn't. But it's not, particularly as bodies have changed over time, and particularly healthier girls from healthier, wealthier backgrounds, you know, begin menstruating earlier and are regarded as children, are certainly not entering adulthood. So bodies change over time, and our ideas about, you know, who how long childhood is also change over time, as our ideas about how education needs to feature in a child's life to prepare them for adulthood. So when we're asking this question, you know, what, I mean, Tenda, I was struck by your use of the word appropriate, you know, and when we ask this question, at what age is it appropriate to get married? We're actually asking a whole lot of other questions of, you know, at what age are you an adult? At what age should the power of your parents over you to make decisions over your future, at what point does that no longer hold? I mean, that's really what the question of the age of consent is about. You know, it's about the power of parents over children, particularly fathers. And so that these become these kind, and I mean, Tendai, when you were asking a question about, you know, this sort of debate within sort of customary law as opposed to the law of the state, is that, you know, it asks us to think, you know, how do we understand what it might be to be an African girl under these particular circumstances, and who might be invested in defining African girls in a very specific way as opposed to other kinds of girls. I hope that makes sense. So my answer to you is that I think we keep on asking these questions is because they raise all sorts of other big questions.
Right. They're a portal to a much wider set of relationships of power. Yeah. Okay, so people are commenting in the chat, but you feel free to raise your hand and ask the question. I don't want to mediate your questions from the chair. Arinola Bello, I haven't read your comment. Do you want to ask it? Do you want to intervene? You don't have to have a question, actually. You can add to the conversation. No?
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I'm in a noisy background. I just wanted to add to what Ms. Duff just said about he's an African girl. I was born in the late 70s, married in my early 20s, and have 3 boys, age 21 to 11. The oldest is my Colombian, and
Oh, I can read the rest of your comment if that's easier for you, Arinola. So she's asking about the impact of greater access to the internet and kind of the importance that it's the important role it's playing in the lives of children, and suggesting that this has led to a fragmentation of families. So I don't know if you want to comment at all on what it means for children to have a loosening of parental control, I guess. You know, on internet may actually simply be one instance of a tussle that has longer roots, perhaps.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing, that I'm always interested. And thank you so much for your question. And also thank you for the interventions from the young people with you. That I'm always struck by how technology seems so frequently to produce these sort of similar response, that this will that whether it's television or the internet or other forms of technology or telephones, you know, that these will loosen the bonds between parents and children. These will undermine parents' authority. And yes, certainly the internet offers children, as both Chris and Monica made the point, offers children a space free of their parents to formulate their own subcultures, their own ways of communicating with each other. Although, of course, as we know, children have been doing this for a very long time. And especially since the 20th century, as sort of, you know, various sort of forces have conspired to produce, particularly in the West, wealthier children who can, and children in school who can sort of gather together and form their own kinds of communities and ways of thinking about themselves. So the internet does certainly provide that space in a way that's different. But I think that it's often worth asking ourselves, and this is an echo of my earlier response, is it's worth asking, you know, why is it that that technology always causes us to ask these questions about the stability of the family, you know, that this is sort of a perennial problem. You know, how does the family navigate social change? You know, how does the family keep, you know, how does the family units, you know, weather the way in which social change happens? At the moment, I'm teaching a course on histories of assisted reproductive technologies. It's sort of a new area of interest of mine. And we've been reading work from historians and anthropologists and sociologists, and something that I found very interesting from a lot of the sociological and anthropological work on families formed as a result of the use of IVF or other similar technologies is the way that while these technologies themselves are they help us to almost imagine ourselves into the future. It feels like, you know, these are the technologies of the future that we're using here today. But they form families in ways that are very familiar and in some ways entrench quite sort of traditional ways of thinking about family, that a family needs to consist of 2 parents who fulfill very particular roles, a certain number of children, and so on. and that these technologies have gone to sort of, in some ways, sort of confirming or sort of reinscribing sort of traditional family forms, and which I find very, very, very interesting. So I suppose that I think often these kinds of questions are about, what's going on in the family in this particular moment of social fracture. And I mean, I thought it was interesting that you grounded your question in this question of COVID, this experience of COVID, which for many families, they experienced each other far more intensely than they had for some time. And no wonder people were reflecting on family to a far greater extent than perhaps previously.
It's also true that, it is often women and children that are the sources of anxiety. It's what's happening to women and children that is the kind of focal point of these larger anxieties about social change, right?
Exactly.
Always articulated around that, what will happen to this sort of often quite mythically generated notion of family.
Absolutely. I mean, this is always about the future. It's
Right.
it's always, what is our future going to look like? And panic. This is what our future is going to look like, and how do we prevent it from being thus? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is the point of the afternoon where people are dashing off because they have class at 2:30. If there aren't any more questions or comments, I think I'm going to use this as the opportunity, because I'm looking at the numbers and I see people leaving, and I know it's the next class that's looming. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this absolutely wonderful book. I did put the link to the book in the chat, but I think you can easily Google Childhood and Youth in African History by S.E. Duff. And it is really an amazing read. Apart from its pedagogical uses, I loved the writing. I loved being able to read it and be engaged by the ideas. So thank you for that. Thanks to Monica and Chris for the great comments that you made. Next week, a whole bunch of people will be at the African Studies Association conference, and so we won't have a meeting because of those competing commitments. But we'll end on October 6th, on December 6th, with Natasha Erlang's book on marriage and Christianity. So thank you all for coming. I'll see you again on the 6th of December. And in the meantime, those of you up north, stay safe, avoid snowstorms, and have a good week. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really grateful. Thank you.